Picture this, a city denser than Manhattan, apartment blocks 9 stories tall, schools, hospitals, a cinema, a pachinko parlor, a swimming pool, thousands of people living their ordinary lives, raising children, going to work, falling in love. Now picture all of it empty. Not in ruins from a war, not slowly hollowed out over decades. Empty because one company sent a letter in January 1974, and within 3 months, every single person was gone. This is Hashima Island, a half-kilometer scrap of rock rising from the East China Sea, 15 kilometers off the coast of Nagasaki. From a distance, it looks like a warship, which is exactly why the Japanese nicknamed it Gunkanjima, Junjiandao, Battleship Island *. Today, the concrete towers are crumbling into the sea, but for nearly a century, this island was one of the most densely populated places on Earth. Welcome back to Lost Japan, where we dig into the stories behind places and moments that history almost forgot. Today, we're going to Hashima Island, a place where Japan's industrial ambition, its wartime darkness, and its stunning ability to simply walk away from the past all collide in about 6 hectares of concrete and rust. Let's start at the beginning. Hashima Island, formerly known as Hashima Duandao, meaning Edge Island, sits in Nagasaki Prefecture, in the waters between Kyushu and China. It's tiny, about 480 meters long and 160 meters wide. You could walk around the entire perimeter in under 15 minutes. Before humans arrived, it was barely more than a reef, a low-lying cluster of rocks that fishermen might navigate around and forget. The island you see today, the towering concrete silhouette, is almost entirely man-made. The coastline was expanded with seawalls. The ground level was raised. Buildings were stacked so high they created artificial canyons of concrete where sunlight barely reached the streets below. Today, Hashima is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. You can take a boat from Nagasaki and walk along a designated viewing path. You'll see the buildings, most of them now listing at dangerous angles, their windows empty, their interiors visible only as dark voids. What you cannot do is enter the ruins. The structures are too unstable. Typhoons hit this part of Japan every year, and each season takes another chunk of the island with it. Slowly, systematically, the sea is reclaiming what was never really supposed to be there. But before all of that, before the UNESCO designation, before the tourists, before the James Bond film that used it as inspiration for a villain's lair, Hashima was simply a place where ordinary people worked extraordinarily hard lives, buried deep beneath the ocean. Coal was discovered beneath Hashima in the 1880s. At the time, Japan was in the middle of one of history's most dramatic transformations, the Meiji Restoration, Ming-ji Wei-shin. In less than a generation, Japan had gone from a feudal society of samurai and shoguns to a rapidly industrializing nation hungry for steel, ships, and energy. Coal was everything. Mitsubishi, already one of Japan's most powerful industrial conglomerates, purchased the island in 1890 for that exact reason. And what followed was a decades-long engineering project that turned a reef into a city. The first concrete high-rise apartment building in Japan was constructed on Hashima in 1916. Think about that. While most of Japan still lived in wooden houses, the miners of Hashima were already living in reinforced concrete, stacked 9 stories high. Not by choice, by necessity. There was simply no room to build outward, so they built up. At its peak in 1959, Hashima was home to 5,259 people, in 6.3 hectares. That's a population density of roughly 835 people per hectare, more than 9 times the density of present-day Tokyo. Families shared tiny apartments. Children went to school on the island. Couples got married in the island shrine. Elderly residents never had reason to leave, sometimes for years at a time. And yet, by most accounts, life on Hashima had a certain intensity to it. A community forged in isolation tends to bond tightly. There were festivals, there were sports teams. The pachinko parlor was always full. Former residents interviewed decades later often described the island with unexpected warmth, a closeness that came from being together on a rock surrounded by open ocean. The coal beneath the island was high quality and abundant. Miners descended in cages to shafts that ran hundreds of meters below sea level, working in tunnels beneath the ocean floor. It was brutal, dangerous work. Temperatures underground could exceed 30 degrees Celsius, and the risk of cave-ins or flooding was constant. But the pay was relatively good, the community was tight, and for many families, Hashima was simply home. Mitsubishi invested steadily. Better housing, better facilities, a proper seawall to protect against typhoons. By the 1960s, Hashima looked from the outside like a small but remarkably modern city, rising incongruously from the East China Sea. But there is a part of Hashima's history that its picturesque ruins cannot fully obscure. During the Second World War, Japan's labor shortage became critical. The solution, for many industrial operations including Hashima, was forced labor. Between roughly 1939 and 1945, an estimated 500 to 1,300 Korean and Chinese laborers were brought to the island under coercion, some forcibly conscripted, others lured with false promises of wages that never materialized. Conditions for these workers were substantially worse than for Japanese miners. They were housed separately, fed less, and assigned the most dangerous tasks. Death records from the period are incomplete and contested, but they exist. The seafloor around Hashima holds that history too. This remains a deeply sensitive issue. When Japan nominated Hashima for UNESCO World Heritage status in 2015, citing it as a symbol of the Meiji Industrial Revolution, South Korea formally objected. Japan ultimately acknowledged in the UNESCO process that there had been forced labor at the site, but the exact framing of that acknowledgement and how it is or isn't communicated to tourists today continues to generate controversy. Hashima's story, in other words, is not simply one of industrial ingenuity and tight-knit community. It's also a story about who bears the cost of a nation's progress and how that cost gets remembered or doesn't. Then came the fall. The fall was quiet, as these things often are. By the 1960s, Japan's energy policy was shifting. Oil was replacing coal as the country's primary fuel. Mine after mine across Japan began closing. Mitsubishi tried to sustain Hashima's operations, but the economics were deteriorating. In January 1974, the announcement came. The Hashima mine would close. Operations would cease. The island would be evacuated. What happened next was almost surreal. Within 3 months, by April 1974, the island was empty. 5,000 people and their entire world gone. Residents took what they could carry. Furniture, appliances, personal items too large to move were simply left where they were. The last boat pulled away from the pier, and Hashima became, almost overnight, a ghost. For 35 years, Hashima sat untouched. The buildings didn't fall immediately. Concrete is stubborn. But the island had no one to maintain the seawalls, no one to patch the roofs, no one to keep the vegetation from pushing through the cracks. Slowly, season by season, the island began to decay. In 2009, Nagasaki reopened part of the island to visitors, and Hashima entered a new chapter, this time as spectacle. The ruins were suddenly everywhere. Documentaries, photography books, and yes, a certain James Bond film where the island's silhouette inspired the villain's island base. Tourism brought attention, but it also brought complications. The buildings are genuinely dangerous. Entry beyond the designated path is forbidden, and even the path itself is occasionally closed after typhoon damage. Pieces of Hashima fall into the sea every year. Former residents formed associations. Some have returned to visit decades later, finding the ghost of a place they once called home. Their testimonies are striking, not predominantly about the hardship, but about the life. The sound of the ocean, the smell of coal, the way everyone knew everyone. In 2015, UNESCO made it official. Hashima Island is a World Heritage Site, recognized as part of Japan's Meiji Industrial Revolution. The battleship has run aground, but it hasn't sunk yet. The story of Hashima Island is, in many ways, a concentrated version of something much larger. A nation builds fast, burns bright, and then moves on, leaving behind the physical evidence of what that progress cost and who paid for it. The concrete is still there. The questions it raises are still there too. Hashima is extraordinary because of its scale and its drama. But Japan has hundreds of places like it. Towns that boomed on coal, on silk, on timber, on fishing, and then went quiet when the industry moved on. Lost places, forgotten places. That's exactly what this channel is about. If this kind of story interests you, there's a lot more where that came from. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And let me know in the comments. Is there a place in Japan you think deserves a closer look? Thanks for watching Lost Japan. I'll see you in the next one.